Good evening, and we continue with Chapter 4, Whites versus Blacks. This is written by T.C. Johnson of J.C. Johnson's Blues. I don't see why white folks don't have no blues. They got all the cash money and brown-skinned women, too. And the other little writing here is by Bob Kaufman. Why are all black lists white? There has been no lack of observers to point out that the blues is becoming diluted, yet often this term has been used to denote what has simply been a process of development. Thus, I would not suggest the term dilution as an accurate description of the processes that affected the evolution of the blues from its vintage Delta recording years in the late 1920s with Charlie Patton and Tommy Johnson, to the emergence in Chicago of Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf, circa 1950. The blues has continued to evolve since 1950 as well, but the most recent signs of alarm refer not simply to evolution, but to a process which has no doubt affected the blues at every stage of its development, but now seems to take on enormous influence and proportions. Dilution, then, becomes specifically relevant to the influence of the white music tradition in its most recent manifestations, and refers to the damage wrought by the white performers as well as the white enthusiasts. Those who feel that the influence of white music has been extensive but not damaging might point out that at least since 1910, black music has been played by hundreds of white imitators. From the jazz age through the swing era and into the present decade, without having effected monumental changes in the blues' enduring vitality. As there have been white imitators, there have also been black musicians who have offered material that could no longer be called strictly blues, in spite of their having derived from a blues tradition. Like John Hurt and Snooks Eglin are two examples, regardless of their stylistic dissimilarities. I am suggesting that each of these men in his own era, Hurt from the 20s through the 60s, Eglin in the 50s and 60s, indicates a weakening or a dilution of the blues. It would be stretching the point to suggest that the existence of the songster, as we might loosely label Hurt and Eglin, threatened the future of the blues artist. For one thing, it might be that a number of the blues musicians who were active before the blues, as we know it, evolved were originally songsters, becoming blues singers only later. Some critics feel that in daily life, outside the recording studio, those artists whom we know as blues singers from their recordings may have relied on material more befitting the songster. This suggestion is countered somewhat by Evans, 1971, who in his study of bluesman Tommy Johnson says, in addition to blues, Johnson had a large repertoire of non-blues or blues-like lyric songs and many dance tunes. The later were played mainly for whites since Negroes danced to the blues. The non-blues material in a bluesman's repertoire hints at his associations with whites, i.e. his white influences. Of course, a moment's thought reveals that the distinction to be made between a blues singer and a songster is quite a complex and dynamic one, with most artists representing a composite of characteristics that increases the complexity of the issue. Still, distinctions can be made. Anyone familiar with the work of Mance Lipscomb John Hurt, Snooks, Eglin, or Leadbelly would understand that in spite of the varying levels of mastery of the blues as a distinct form displayed by these artists, they are more songsters than bluesmen. In the same fashion, in spite of the propensity of certain blues singers to include popular material in their repertoires, some artists are more clearly bluesmen than songsters. Kokomo Arnold, Petey Wheatstraw, and Leroy Carr are excellent examples. Yet it is my feeling that while the blues singer and the songster coexisted for many years, and in some instances the two functions may have been handled by a single artist, the songster at least signaled the beginning of an assimilation process that would eventually have more dire effects on the blues singer's future. No doubt, the blues has always undergone a more or less continuous commercialization since its very inception. But my hypothesis suggests a quantitative phenomenon which has begun to display qualitative effects in the last decade. The blues singer is more and more becoming the songster for specific reasons, perhaps no different from those that were operative 40 or 50 years ago. The process has undergone a certain magnification which compels our attention. The songster is the effect, not the cause. While others have made roughly this same observation, often with a keen sense of the contributing factors, there have been some whose insight is quite accidental, a result of poor exposure more than clear comprehension. Thus, several years ago, blues fans and journalists from Europe visiting Chicago declared that the blues are dead in Chicago, before even visiting any of Chicago's blues clubs on the South and West Side or Maxwell Street. Poor Hound Dog Taylor, poor Carrie Bell, poor J.B. Hutto, poor Eddie Taylor. With fewer and fewer black musicians relying on blues singing to make their living, one would hope that those who are still doing so would at least be recognized. But why are fewer and fewer blues singers around? Why does there come a time when it is difficult to discern a Junior Wells or a Buddy Guy performance from a James Brown performance? And why does a really first-rate bluesman like Howlin' find himself represented on an album called Message to the Young? An album which in every respect is garbage. Why, indeed? The ultimate answer to these questions are to be found, of course, in the all-pervasive encroachments of the vast modern industrial reorganization developed during and after World War II. Black workers are no longer, in any sense, a peripheral subcategory of the American working class. Their crucial position in heavy industry today, as well as in the so-called service industries, like the post office or municipal transportation, gives them a revolutionary potential, far exceeding that of any sector of the workforce in U.S. history. The large-scale black insurrections that convulsed the U.S. a few years ago in Watts, Philadelphia, Chicago, Newark, Detroit, and numerous other cities convey an idea of the black population's changed mood as a result of its social transformation from a royal proletariat into a largely urbanized and industrial proletariat. These changes like all rapid and sweeping social changes, disoriented and bewilderment, not only among the older people who attained maturity in far different conditions, but also among the youth, observing their parents' bewilderment and noting how so many older values seem no longer to apply. Black youths often become unsure of their own roots, their own identity, as it is said, and consequently their own real capacities. The recent fad throughout U.S. black ghettos for Mohammedan paraphernalia and for African items generally reflects the same disorientation and confusion that has sent hordes of white U.S. youths into equally retrograde and ridiculous fads such as communes, Maoism, macrobiotic diets, and crackpot psychotherapies. The official values and the institutions upholding them have collapsed. All those who no longer expect anything from the existing order have begun the arduous search for solutions outside the prevailing frameworks. The dialects of the social process, of course, preclude any simple-minded formalism in this regard. Sometimes an intrinsically worthless doctrine or trend can provide a point of departure for truly significant developments. Malcolm X, for example, began formulating his critique of the repressive structure of advanced industrial society as a member of the Black Muslims. Even the commercial fetishization of African artifacts in one sector of the Black intelligentsia focused attention on Black civilizations, and thus could be said to have contributed to a fundamental reassessment of the course of world history. Side note: for an interesting presentation of this whole question, see The Groundings with My Brothers by the Guyanese Walter Rodney, London, Bogle, Lovature Publications, 1970, especially the chapter titled African History in the Service of Black Revolution. Okay, back to the main thing here. What must be emphasized, however, is that this process has left very little unchanged. The smallest details of everyday life, dress, hairstyles, argot, differ drastically from what they were 10 or 20 years ago. Not even the blues, or perhaps we should say especially not the blues, which for decades has been the most sensitive seismograph recording every tremor of the Black population, has been able to remain above the fray. The blues singer, proud and arrogant, sure of himself or herself, relatively immune to the more absurd bourgeoisie conventions, a free agent, indifferent and even hostile to the Protestant ethic and the repressive myths of responsibility, to which he or she is invariably content to oppose a round of whiskey, a good laugh, and the ardor of love. The blues singer no longer holds the same position in Black society as he or she enjoyed in bygone years. Moreover, those Blacks from whom the post-war reorganization of industry had fostered the illusion of making it, of becoming integrated into the acquisitive, conspicuous consumption society. Those who constitute the minuscule, pathetic, but none the less vulnerable would-be Black bourgeoisie, and not a few of their dupes among the ranks of Black labor are altogether ready to find the blues singer an anachronism, an embarrassing relic of a heritage they would prefer to deny. This small ersatz bourgeoisie, an insignificant social force compared to the white bourgeoisie, nonetheless wields an ideological influence in the ghetto entirely out of proportion to its real strength or historical destiny. It is in immediate control of most of the black press, the black radio stations, black advertising, many black studies programs at universities, almost all the channels of black culture. I say immediate control because, in truth, this parasitical sector is merely carrying out the orders of the Rockefellers and the DuPonts. These black bureaucrats pretend that the blues singers are archaic, obsolescent, left behind, etc. But the blues singers appear lost at sea only to those who mistakenly believe that they've set foot on dry land. For ideologues of black capitalism, the blues is above all a blunt reminder that their pretensions are only pretensions, and that their days are numbered. The slick, dishonest maneuvering of those hired lackeys constrains sharply with the resonant candor and simplicity of the blues. A rude awakening is in store for those who look down on the blues as ancient history. Those who, as Big Bill Brunzi said, got the blues and don't know it. It goes without saying, therefore, that the hopefully temporary isolation of the blues singer from the black community during the uninspiring heyday of Motown and soul in no way mitigates the revolutionary poetic characters of the blues. I think it was Muddy Waters who said, "The boogaloo ain't gonna make no history." It is no less plain that the soul market, with its younger and more responsive audience, presents the young, lower-class black musician with a temptation that is hard to resist. Some bluesmen, such as Otis Rush, have always considered soul and R&B hits as potential sources of repertoire, without thereby totally sacrificing their role as bluesmen. Other blues singers are coming to rely more and more on R&B material. We must admit the possibility that many young black musicians begin as soul performers today, when 20 years ago they might have become blues singers. The declining popularity of the blues is inseparable from the rise of the soul phenomenon. But the question remains, why has the blues declined in popularity in the black community? The answer lies, as I have suggested, in the contradictory development of ghetto culture throughout the process of urbanization and industrialization. The black worker's assumption of a decisive strategic position at the point of industrial production is accompanied, often, by contradictory accommodation on the plane of everyday life and under the tutelage of the black bourgeoisie to essentially bourgeoisie values. One step forward, 2 steps back. The increasing alienation brought about by the urbanization process leads to the creation of a false need for a less forthright presentation in terms of the aesthetic illusion. Then, the blues usually permits. The unhappy effort to adapt to what seems to be a more civilized, alienated standard implies the rejection of one's own uncivilized desires. The increasing alienation carries with it, rather explicitly, I think, an estrangement from the blues. For the blues is above all a vehicle of desire, linked closely, indeed too closely for modern tastes, to the unconscious. By alienation, I am implying not just a distance maintained by secondary elaboration and aesthetic disguise in art, but also certain affective states related to revulsion, and in turn in anxiety. That is, to an inability or an unwillingness to recognize one's own instinctual impulses. It is this feeling towards one's own basic desires that makes the blues, in its candor and simplicity, offensive to the prevailing moral code. Ami Sassari from 1972 has pointed out that blacks have always been doubly alienated and proletarianized, first as workers, then as blacks, but the blues has always reflected the incomplete aspects, the loopholes of this alienation for the black worker. A more complete and thorough alienation includes a rejection of the blues, as always typified the black middle class. Even here, however, there are exceptional cases that reveal only a superficial rejection. Beneath the superficial disgust, we find traces of a more permanent affinity. This is not a question, of course, of innate disposition, but simply one of public attitude and display. As blues singers Coco Taylor said O'Neill in 1971, so many people, if you meet them on the street, they'll say they don't like the blues, but if you follow them home, you'll see a whole stack of B.B. King LPs and Howlin' Wolves and Muddies, the whole thing. With the rise in popularity of soul music in the black community, and with the corresponding decline in popularity of the blues, there has been an enormous ascendance in the popularity of the blues among young whites. There is little doubt that what have attracted the whites are precisely those aspects for which the blues has been partially rejected in the black community. In fact, it can be considered a minor cultural revolution of our time that millions of white youths, and not only in English-speaking countries, but in France, Germany, Sweden, and the Soviet Union, not to mention the non-white youths of Japan and elsewhere in Asia, declare themselves ardent enthusiasts of the blues. Yet, while the intentions of the white enthusiasts are good, their effect, in the U.S. at least, could be annihilating. Signs of these ill effects began to appear following the 1960s boom in rediscovering 1920s country blues singers, when the blues singers began to get more offers for appearances at colleges and nightclubs. As the white public demanded for blues began to increase, so did the number of white imitators. Often, blues-based rock bands are paid hundreds, if not thousands of dollars more than black blues bands appearing at the same clubs or festivals. There's nothing really new about this, of course. The essence of the matter was uncovered long ago by René Creviel, 1932, in a passionate surrealist critique of contemporary ideology, when he wrote that, for whites, blacks are only means, occasions for diversion, like the slaves of rich Romans during the late Empire. As examples of this exploitative exalticism, Creville cited the success in Paris of orchestras from Harlem and all the tom-toms of the colonial exhibition. Moreover, the phenomenon did not go unnoticed by the blues singers themselves, many of whom, ever hopeful of increasing their popularity as well as their earnings, began to play music which they hoped would be more pleasing to their new white audience. Just as it was difficult for John Lomax in 1940 to convince blind Willie Mae McTell to play real blues, as well as some songs fitting Lomax's peculiar idea of protest music. For him, a white man, rather than that particular segment of McTell's repertoire which was reserved for whites. It became increasingly difficult to convince blues singers of the 60s and 70s that their white audience actually wanted to hear the blues. At times, it is doubtful if such an audience did want to hear the blues. I have said that it is difficult to distinguish a James Brown performance from a Junior Wells or Buddy Guy performance at a blues festival such as Ann Arbor, 1970. But when Wells or Guy are back in Chicago at a black club, the clowning diminishes. They play more actual blues material, and they refrain from playing short segments of songs as they did at Ann Arbor. Most of the clowning, pop material, and song snatches are reserved for whites only. If a bluesman decides to ignore the demands of his white audience, he finds that his own integrity means little to the capitalist predilections of the recording company owners. Thus, countless country and urban blues singers have been recorded recently with the most ludicrous and degrading accompaniments imaginable, all designed to increase the marketability of the LPs by capturing larger segments of the rock-buying public. It would be silly, of course, to assume that in a capitalist economy, that value in dollars of the blues at the point of consumption would not affect its vitality at the point of production, even if a case could be made for a less reprehensible commodity approach to art. It must be admitted that it was precisely this commodity approach that many record companies operated under in the 1950s, when they produced hundreds of magnificent blues records. They continue to operate under it now and produce huge piles of useless trash. The record company owners who would make such an anti-commodity case find themselves in a peculiar position, for it is often their task to manipulate their performers in a quest for authenticity to such an extent that the performer's authenticity is in fact abandoned, and all that is retained is its appearance. As an example, consider Big Bill Broonzy with over 200 records, countless performances as evidence. Broonzy remained an authentic bluesman until the day he died. The bulk of his recordings demonstrate that his most typical accompaniment consisted of his own guitar, often electrified, a piano, and after 1936, a trumpet or a saxophone, drums, etc. This was the instrumentation that he used for several decades in Chicago, and there is little doubt that the music he produced was authentic. Yet when he was rediscovered by whites in the late 40s and early 50s, when he was introduced on stage as ex-plowhand Big Bill Broonzy, after living in Chicago's black ghetto for 20 years, It was necessary for him to play an acoustic guitar without accompaniment, as he had done on his first records in 1927, to reestablish his authenticity. In a milder and more subtle form, this same practice continues. A performer whose tastes and ideas establish his authenticity as a folk performer, outside a particular critic's or record producer's conception of the blues, often must sacrifice his real identity in order to produce an authentic blues album. Thus, when the excellent recordings made by Memphis Slim for VJ in 1959 were released on LP, Memphis Slim at the Gates of Horn, a downbeat reviewer rated the performance as poor. Clearly, in those days, Chicago blues were not in. Solo piano was more ethnic, and the reviewer bemoaned the fact that Memphis Slim's piano playing was not given a more dominant role in the session. Rather than pursue this particular question any further, I would only like to mention that the subject of authenticity is little discussed today, perhaps because the blues singers themselves never cared, and the white enthusiasts have come full circle. Before discussing the influence of blacks on whites, wherein much will be taken for granted and go unmentioned, there are a few more words that must be said regarding the influence of whites on blacks. As a point of departure, I would like to cite a number of references made by Charles Keel in his writing Urban Blues from 1966. Keel ardently defends certain current developments of black music, most specifically the slickest styles of blues. Popularity seems to be the only measure of evaluation Keel is inclined to accept, although he harbors no fond feelings for the most popular tendencies of black music, Motown, etc. More justifiably, Keel criticizes the psychoanalytic studies of Cardinier and Ovacy from 1962, and others for failing to generate a relevant interpretive schema in which to present their clinical findings, obtained from psychological studies of blacks. Keel's point is that those traits, which the clinicians found feminine in the men, process rags, a certain gait, etc., are actually quite masculine and are culturally determined. While this is true to the point of being trite, what is missing from both Keel's analysis as well as his opponents is a psychoanalytic study, not only of such culture traits, but of the entire culture in which they occur. Without pretending to provide even an outline for such a study here, I think it is justifiable to point out that Keel's characteristic attitude of relativism contains certain dangers. Listening to the big beat radio stations, Keel says, I find it increasingly difficult to separate white and Negro performers. So do we all. Keel also quotes a blues fan, black, who feels that B.B. King has made the blues presentable. No harps, moaning, or shit like that. These guys have brought the blues up to date and made it modern. None of that nasty gut bucket stuff. Of course, nasty is the key word here, hinting at the offensiveness of the real blues. I am not suggesting that B.B. King at the time of Keel's book was anything but a first-rate bluesman. But what was implied by Keel's interviewee was a growing alienation that makes the real nasty blues unacceptable. Keel also suggests that if the ancient blues singer who performs at the festivals in Europe were to appear at the Regal or Apollo, they would be hooted off stage. No doubt Keel is correct in this citation of this imaginary incident as proof that the urban, modern blues are what the people want. The old blues, the country blues, are unwanted and old-fashioned. But Keel begs the question by not probing into the difference between the two styles. Indeed, he seems to consider the question settled by the process of stylistic evolution and the demands of culture. But the question is not settled, certainly not in terms of the poetic assault on consciousness. My own personal feeling is that if James Brown has eclipsed Lightnin' Hopkins in popularity, so much the worse poetically for everyone. Modern blues, which to Keel included not only Howling Wolf, Muddy Waters, and B.B. King, but also Bobby Bland and others, tends, in its most sophisticated performers, to leave behind the power of the image and the capacity of fantasy, and to concentrate almost without even a glimmer of imagination on more mundane activities. The subject matter of early blues was frequently mundane as well, but it was precisely the inspired manner in which such subjects were dealt with that singularly distinguished the blues from other forms. Today, the most modern blues are often lyrically indistinguishable from R&B and soul music in their increasing vapidity. Keel misses the point when he says, a ... factor here is historical respectability. A chorus lyric of 30 years ago has poetic qualities and historic interest. Much the same kind of lyric today is considered frivolous and not worthy of scholarly attention. Keel is right for the wrong reasons. The truth is that it is very difficult to find the same kind of lyric today. The reason the lyric of today distinguishes itself from the lyric of earlier decades is that the lyric of earlier decades tended to be imaginative, while the lyric of today tends to be vapid. To avoid misunderstanding, let me clarify several points. By the lyric of earlier decades, I refer mostly to country blues, and not so much to the vaudevillian compositions of professional songwriters, which were, it is true, often performed by exceedingly fine blues artists, such as Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. By the lyric of today, I refer not to Howling Wolf, Muddy Waters, and B.B. King of the 50s and 60s, but to a larger extent to the music of today, the 70s, when the lyrics of even such stalwarts as Howlin' Wolf tend to be devoid of imagination, and when singers like Bobby Bland are considered by many to be the epitome of the low-down blues, in spite of their musical polish and lyrical sterility. B.B. King has quite recently begun to follow a similar pattern, using empty lyrics, a slick female chorus on his records, etc. This trend has already been designated dilution, by which I mean the increasing corruption by the whites of the black music world. It is easy to see that, except for a few performers, the blues will soon become merged with soul and R&B, and it will cease to exist as an autonomous current. That this may revitalize soul music is one thing. It remains to be seen. But it will be the death of the blues as we know it, and in a certain sense, the poetic assault on consciousness becomes neutralized. While this seems to be the historical position of the blues lyric, the same cannot be said of black musical development as a whole. The diminution is important of the lyric, and I'm assuming that its importance is directly related to its power. Its poetry has been accompanied by other developments on the non-verbal plane. The imagination has retained its rights in the field of jazz, while it has lost them, at least lyrically, in the field of the blues. The experiments and advances of contemporary jazz musicians, especially those associated with movements such as the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, AACM, in Chicago, indicate that the vitality of the imagination has not been forsaken. Yet the audience of ultra-modern jazz is infinitesimal compared to that of the blues of 30 and 40 years ago. And this we must not only mourn but vigorously denounce as well. The effectiveness of white assimilation and amalgamation techniques has nearly destroyed one of the only mass-based poetic activities in the U.S. As an activity of the mind, poetry lives on in jazz, but in different forms and in different ways, without the rich scope of the blues as song. Let's see what we can do here. This is hardly the place to undertake a detailed discussion of the complex interrelationships between the blues and jazz, but it is certainly worth protesting here, or anywhere for that matter, at any time, the current cretinizing notion that the blues is more intimately linked to rock by way of the lamentable hybrid blues rock and so-called white blues than to the most recent developments in jazz. The pretensions of the protagonists of white blues are assailed and hopefully successfully undermined elsewhere in these pages. Let us here note only the insidious manner in which certain well-meaning critics and scholars, in this regard, play entirely into the hands of the most venal and reactionary scum. The fact that jazz magazines like the with Downbeat in the lead have long tended to chronicle the trivial antics of rock has certainly not helped matters. But far worse is the tortuous argument of the French critic André Haldier in his Toward Jazz from 1962, that the spirit of the blues is not, in the Husserlian sense of the term, essential to jazz. Haldier is, of course, a serious critic, notwithstanding occasional lapses into hilarious pseudo-profundity. His writing often stands in marked contrast to the frivolous, superficial, anecdotal style prevalent among most U.S. and British critics. But the remark just quoted is wrong, to say the least, and even dangerously wrong. Regardless of Hodier's own intentions, his attitude here, in its skeptical bad faith, reinforces the whole modern retrograde tendency to isolate jazz, to confine it to the rarefied mists of a perfectly abstract, aesthetic ivory tower. The much publicized assimilation of jazz into the machinery of bourgeoisie culture, which is supposed to have taken place in recent years, proof of which, we are told, lies in the popularity of such musicians as Dave Brubeck and Jerry Mulligan, as well as in the posthumous recuperation of Charlie Parker and others, has been accompanied by vicious attempts to suppress the younger and most revolutionary currents in jazz. It is no accident that the young jazz revolutionaries have affirmed their deep-rooted affinity for the blues. But it is also no accident that contemporary ideology, as always, in the service of repression, maintains that the legitimate heir of the blues is to be found in rock and soul, and that the most recent jazz is the inaccessible, exclusive domain of a small, cynical. The inaccessible character of the jazz of ornate Coleman and Pharaoh Saunders. I cite these two because both began as bluesmen and have remained imbued with the blues spirit in their most adventurous explorations. Demonstrates only the extent to which bourgeoisie society has perfected its repressive techniques. As Louis Aragon from 1931 said before his domestication, wild beasts in a cage are wild beasts just the same. As for Hodier, his admiration for Stan Getz, and eventually for Frank Sinatra, lets the cat out of the phenomenological bag. Let us concede readily that the blues is not essential, in the Husserlian or any other sense, to the musical practice of these gentlemen. But then jazz, and especially the essence of jazz, has little to do with Getz, not to mention Sinatra. On this matter, Eric Hobsbawm, otherwise known as Francis Newton, from 1959, has said what has to be said. The blues is not a style or phase of jazz, but a permanent substratum of all styles, not the whole of jazz, but its heart. More importantly, the jazz people themselves provide moving and incontrovertible testimony along the same lines. A single example of inestimable authority will suffice here. On the last day of his life, Charlie Parker expressed his sorrow that many of the young guys coming up didn't know or had forgotten their foundation, the blues. And he added, that's the basis of jazz. Yet it is necessary to reiterate that what I have been describing regarding the blues is a tendency and a transformation, and not so much a static end product, devoid of any sense of movement or dynamism. Thus it would be silly to gather from my discussion that I am unaware of the existence of such fine bluesmen as Jimmy Dawkins, J.B. Hutto, Luther Allison, Homesick James, Carrie Bell, Hound Dog Taylor, Freddie King, and countless others. It would be equally silly to assume that my analysis foretells the doom of these individuals, while the history of the blues is the history of the individuals who perform it. The danger lies in these performers becoming isolated from their richest traditions and from people as a whole, resulting in a total fragmentation of the blues. This, of course, is the tendency of advanced industrial society, wherein any attempt at creative activity on a mass level is inevitably short-circuited and smashed. Thus, in a sense, the poetry of the blues meets the same fate that met most trends of American poetry in general so many years ago. Let's see. We got about 4 pages left, and it is pretty dark. So I'm going to stop there. Okay, where are we? Didn't make it to an hour. I'm going to read a little further. We now have to, it's a new section here. We now have to consider the psychological relevance of the black man to the white man and what effect this has on the evolution of the blues. As a starting point, I would like to quote the psychoanalyst Richard Sturba, 1947. The male Negro, as he appeared in dreams of white people, often had to be recognized as representative of the dreamer's father, particularly the father at night or in his nocturnal activities. Sturba also pointed out how blacks come to unconsciously represent siblings to the whites. Dream symbols, of course, do not refer only to dream life, but are in fact one of the few indications we have of the nature of the unconscious activity that exists in us day and night. The dream is not the unconscious, but it gives... lost my spot because my light went out. The dream is not the unconscious, but it gives an occasional glimpse of how our unconscious operates when we are awake, as well as when we sleep. Later, we shall discuss symbolism at length, but at this juncture it is worthwhile to establish a few basic points. Individuals do not choose what a symbol represents to their unconscious, although they can, in a sense, choose, again, not consciously, which symbol they may use. In spite of the multiplicity of symbols, those ideas which are symbolized are very few indeed. Birth, death, the self, members of one's family, parts of the body, etc. Additionally, symbols have a universal meaning, not through archetypal inheritance, as Jung would have it, but through individuals who create symbols for themselves out of their common experience. Thus it is the common ontogenic development of mankind, and not necessarily the phylogenetic development that gives symbols their universal meaning. Symbol interpretation, in spite of its being one of the few areas in which psychoanalysts can look to other fields, like folklore, mythology, art, and etc., for confirmation, is considered by many to be the most far-fetched aspect of psychoanalysis. In analytic patients, symbol interpretation is usually met with total disbelief or disgust. Some critics feel that to interpret symbols is to rob life of its more varied meaning. For indeed, what have we left if everything we relate to is only our fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, birth or death? Perhaps no one has answered this objection better than Roheim from 1950. I never think it necessary to emphasize the obvious. It is fairly obvious that a grown man is not quite the same as a 5-year-old child, and that the President of the United States is not really the father of all the patients in whose dreams he might occur in that role. After Freud managed to dive to the bottom of the ocean, people now tell us that the ocean has a surface. And thus simply I am not suggesting that the black man is only father or brother to the white. Rather, it is an additional unconscious dimension of black-white relations. A dimension, the analysis of which will, I hope, illuminate several trends that run through the white blues world. Side note, A dream reported to me by a young white blues fan produced much embarrassment in the dreamer. While he was sleeping, someone put on a record by Howlin' Wolf. He immediately began to dream of a jungle with large apes swinging noisily through the trees. His embarrassment stemmed from his feeling that the dream revealed hidden prejudice, but it also seemed likely that the dream work had made use of his tendency to allow one symbol for the father, like Howling Wolf, to be replaced by another, the apes. If it is true that the black man is unconsciously identified with the father by whites, we can expect the whites' attitudes towards the blacks to reflect this identification. It is my feeling that this unconscious identification contributes to certain tendencies in the white blues world, tendencies that place the highest premium on those aspects of the blues most divorced from creativity. I feel also that this unconscious identification with the father or brother manifests itself in relation to the ideas of success, competition, and fear of success, all of which may operate unconsciously, but which nevertheless contribute in large measure to the peculiar position of the white blues performer. To be more explicit, numerous whites who are devoted to playing country blues guitar consider it the highest mark of their achievement to be able to play a tune, note for note, exactly as it was played by the original recording artist. I would say that in America, this sort of performer completely dominates the higher echelons of the white country blues milieu. Creativity, imagination, improvisation, all are ignored and demeaned in pursuit of faultless imitation. In contrast, those white blues instrumentalists who are drawn to the more urban electric blues almost invariably do something to identify themselves to the listener as white. The most favored mechanisms are having the entire band perform lead solos at the same time, playing much louder than any black blues band. I once attended a Howling Wolf Club date with the members of an extremely popular white blues band. When we left, one of the band members approached me and said rather boastingly, pointing back at Wolf, "Shit, man, we play twice as loud as that." Funny. Trying to jam many more notes into every bar of every solo, providing a harmonic background or melodic lead that is of such a nature as to label the performance distinctively as rock rather than blues. When it is recalled that nearly all those country blues guitarists who are imitated so ardently are dead, and when it is realized that the majority of the great urban blues guitar stylists are still alive, it becomes less hazardous to suggest that, indeed, unconscious identifications play a large part in the life of the white blues musician, and that these identifications make themselves known by determining certain patterns relating to competition, success, and fear of competition and success. Side note. It should not be thought that I am suggesting that all musicians of one sort are victims of a particular Oedipial solution, while other sorts of musicians are victims of another. This might be true, but the evidence is lacking. Rather, it should be remembered that patterns of competition are established through the resolution of the Oedipus complex, and as well as through one's early relations with one's siblings. Thus, the idea being dealt with are present in all of us, and it is the specific way of dealing with these ideals, defense mechanisms, as well as character structure that attracts our interest. Once again, no attempt is being made to assert that in certain styles of musicianship, certain defense styles predominate, although this may be the case. Alright, we're stopping there because it is dark. And I just read that part. So there's like 3 pages, and then I should be rolling into chapter 5, which is imagination, instincts, and reality. I can't show you my book because it's too gosh darn dark. But a lot of birds are rolling in, and we had a wonderful sunset together. I appreciate you being with me. I've been reading a book titled Blues and the Poetic Spirit by Paul Garon. Thank you for being with me.